Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is the monthly wrap-up for June of 2023. So I'm going to be talking about the books that I finished reading in June of 2023. All of these books I have talked about more in depth in previous videos. Sometimes those are the Fresh Read Kills videos where I do my regular reading updates and I give my overall thoughts on things in a little more in-depth manner. Or they might be in Book Trek videos, because this summer is the summer of Trek, where we are essentially for 3 months reading and celebrating the geekery that is Star Trek fiction. And I have individual videos about each of those books. So any of the things that I talk about here, if you're interested in knowing my further thoughts on them, you can just check out those individual videos. This will just be a very quick summary of the things that I read. So to start off, I read My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier, which I was highly impressed by. Now I read this because Carrie, that very literary Carrie, she has a monthly Black Hearts book club where they read books of a slightly darker nature. Sometimes they're true crime or, in this case, more of a gothic read. And this was their pick, and this is something that I had been wanting to read for a long time. I had picked this copy up actually at a Goodwill a while back, but it's actually, surprising how good condition overall it is. And I had read du Maurier's Rebecca 2 years ago, and I was highly impressed with the writing, although I did end up liking this story more. So essentially we have a young 20-something who is heir to an estate in England. His older cousin, who basically raised him, is sickly. He owns the estate. He goes to Italy in order to basically improve his health in a warmer climate. He meets his cousin Rachel, and they get married, but he ends up dying in Italy. And the protagonist, the 20-something-year-old protagonist in this, is convinced that Rachel is basically a murderess, that she killed him, his cousin. But even though he vows revenge on Rachel, when she shows up to England, he is basically head over heels in love with her. And the whole time as a reader, you are left wondering exactly who this Rachel is and what she is about. Is she a murderess? Is she innocent? I think that this book, which I called in my review a masterclass in ambiguity, is highly effective in making us never sure exactly who is right and who is wrong. And by the end of it, you may have a lot of your earlier assumptions completely turned upside down. But I thought it was beautifully written. I love the writing on this. And the story, even though it is slow going, this is not like a action-packed page turner. This is much more of like a character study. We're in the mind of one person who is fairly young and naive in very many ways and can be frustrating. By the end of it, I was highly impressed with what we got, and I just thought the prose was beautiful. So I really liked this one, My Cousin Rachel, Daphne du Maurier. The next book I finished, and I'm kind of doing these in order, although I might mess that up a little bit, we'll see. The order in which I read them. Got Tales of Valhalla, Norse Myths and Legends. So I read this for Historathon 2023. That is a year-long reading event where we are looking at nonfiction history, and we've divided the year up into 4 quarters, each 3 months long, and each quarter looks at a different period of history. June was the final part of quarter 2, which looked at the years 500 CE up to the year 1500. And I read this, a retelling basically of Norse myths and legends. For that. So these authors, Martyn, Whittock, and Hannah Whittock, they have basically taken they're not just basically, they're not just retelling myths out of context. That's where I think this is valuable. So what you have here is a retelling, but they do it within the context of where these things originate, where they are found. They give you some background into the manuscript that you can find it in. Some stuff that maybe was added later by, of course, Christian interpreters and Christian scribes. So these stories are never taken out of the context of the sources. So there's other places that you can certainly go to read Norse legends. And maybe they're written in a more exciting way that's meant to be more engaging. That's not what they're going for here. I think they're going for a very understandable, digestible accuracy as much as possible. Sometimes synthesizing various sources to try and make some sort of cohesive narrative, and they usually let you know when they're doing that. So this isn't probably the most exciting version of these tales, but I think that there is value in knowing where those stories came from. So I'm really glad that I read this, and I do love this cover design. I always, with few exceptions, books on Norse history usually have the most beautiful cover designs, in my opinion. Next, and I think that's the only nonfiction book that I read this month. I usually am very nonfiction heavy in my reading, and I was originally intending to read mostly nonfiction for June, but I kept on jumping into buddy reads with with Mark from Book Time with Elvis. So this ended up being far more fiction heavy than usual, which might be why I got through a good number of books. I can usually read fiction a lot faster. Including this, we've got Louis L'Amour's The Tall Stranger. I read this one for June on the Range. This is the second year that that booktube event has taken place. It was created by Michael K. Vaughan, and it is basically a month where Western literature is celebrated. So I picked up this copy of Louis L'Amour from, I think, Walmart. They always carry them, at least in my local Walmart. They're like $7. And last year I read a Louis L'Amour, that one I think was Dark Canyon, and I enjoyed that one overall. I thought that one was fun. This one I didn't quite like as much. Here we have a story of these people who are, basically they're on the Oregon Trail, heading out west, and they're convinced by the tall stranger, this guy who's very charismatic, to take a different trail, farther to the, that goes farther basically to the south. And he tells them that, oh no, it's much better. Everybody's going to be using it in the future. You'll definitely get to California quicker. And, they listen to him. And it turns out to not be that great, but they do come to this beautiful valley. And the tall stranger is trying to convince them, well, why don't we just stop here and just live in this valley? The problem is that the valley is owned by a very kind of rich cattle rancher. And I'll kind of leave it at that. So it's a pretty good setup for this, but a lot of the mystery and tension is pretty much lost by the first half of the book, and we have a lot of it just people basically chasing each other around and shooting each other, which can be fun, but it starts to feel pretty drawn out at times when you see what's coming. You're just like, all right, let's just get to it. These westerns are not always, they don't always have unexpected twists to them, and this one certainly doesn't either. And we also we have this was published in 1957, I believe this one was. Yeah. We definitely have some 1950s racism towards Native Americans in this. There is a character who is constantly referred to as a half-breed, and it's basically characterized that his being a half-breed is part of the reason that he is a villain. So I expect to find that stuff inside books like this, but I think it's only fair that I mention them because it is something from a 21st century reader's mind that kind of keeps, taking me out of the book when I come across that stuff. I don't judge books usually outside of their own time period, but I'm reading this in 2023, so that's the kind of stuff that jumps out at me. So do with that what you will. The next book that I read, a lot of older stuff, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Originally published, I believe, in 1910, if I'm correct. Originally in French. Everybody knows the Phantom of the Opera. You've got the Paris Opera House, which is supposedly kind of haunted by this phantom. But of course, it's a real man named Eric who is deformed and wearing a mask. And basically, the Opera House is his old dark house of horrors. He has secret passages all over the place. He has traps. He rigs things, he has people basically terrified that there's really a ghost. But even when you realize it's not a ghost, he's still something who is formidable. And I enjoyed this quite a bit. Our two central heroes, if we count Christine as one of the heroes, and then Raoul, who she falls in love with. Raoul is a pretty boring character, but Eric, the Phantom, I thought was actually quite fascinating. And this was far more sometimes funny than I expected it to be. and also adventurous. I didn't expect this to be more of an adventure novel than really. I mean, it's kind of gothic, but it really has a sense of fun about it. The whole last third of it, in my review, not review, but real discussion of this, I had said that the third act is pretty much like a long dungeon crawl. And that's really what it reminded me of. It's like going through a D&D campaign. You've got different levels and traps, and you come across weird things, and you're trying to get, out of binds. It really did feel like I was reading almost like a D&D campaign at times. Which was fun. I really enjoyed it. There's a lot of melodrama in here. Some of it, is like, but it's about an opera house, so opera's very melodramatic, so I kind of go with it. Some of the melodrama, though, works. Especially when it comes to Eric. I thought those scenes were actually pretty good. So I like this one quite a bit, The Phantom of the Opera. And I read this. This is probably the biggest book that I read. This one took me like 2 weeks at least. Maybe more than that to read. It took me a while. But this was I, Claudius by Robert Graves, originally published in 1934. And this is I don't know exactly when the historical fiction genre really jumped off, but I think this was at least an early and influential one. I know it existed in the pulps, but I don't know how much of it was more like a serious literature sort of thing. People know that. I'd be curious to know when, historical fiction as a proper subgenre really kind of comes into its own. But anyway, I'm guessing this is fairly an early attempt at it, and an overall successful attempt. We have basically the history of the early Roman Empire as seen from the eyes of Claudius, who would, of course, become emperor as well. Somebody who was lame and had a stutter and who was underestimated his whole life. He's basically talking about his family history from his grandparents, Augustus and Livia, down to his parents, his uncles, his brothers, and basically his cousins, his various families, nephew. So all the sort of people being poisoned and and overthrown, and it's a nice fun romp through the early Roman Empire as seen from somebody who has access to the sort of elite center, who is of them but not exactly of them, who is also apart from them. So that apart from them is one way, of course, that his character survives, as long as it does. But it also means that you might be able to hear the rain starting to pound on my window that I have in front of me. It also means that he's not really a central character throughout most of the book. So I wasn't expecting that exactly. But I did actually really enjoy this. I liked a lot of the dialogue. I liked how it was, in many ways, kind of a celebration or rumination of history and what it means to be a historian and to love history and want to know about the past and document it. That stuff is all in here as well. So glad I read this one. I do want to read Claudius the God. I don't want to jump into it yet. I can definitely give it some time, and this this is still, even though I enjoyed it, it's it demands a lot of attention because there's so many names that you have to try and keep track of and who is who. So I don't want to go through that again yet, especially not in a fictionalized form. But I will eventually get to Claudius the God. So Robert Graves, I, Claudius. The last thing I'll talk about very quickly, these were for Book Trek 2023. I had read The Vulcan Academy Murders by Jean Lorrah. This one was published in, I think, 1984. Yeah. So it's not super early, but it is an earlier Star Trek novel. And I like this one quite a bit. It is a murder mystery that you can see takes place at the Vulcan Academy of Sciences. And the murder mystery itself is not the strong part. What I really liked about this was the character work. The character work on Spock, on Kirk, on McCoy, and also Sarek, Spock's father, and a couple of other characters that we meet, such as Kerrigan, a human doctor, and Tamir, who is a Vulcan who, is basically a love interest of Kerrigan and how they handle that. This is a nice follow-up to certain original series episodes like Amok Time and Journey to Babel, both of which dealt with Vulcan society. So overall, I really liked that stuff, and I thought the writing was very strong in this as well. So it wasn't the murder mystery that really sold it for me, it was the character work and the writing. I thought all stuff was pretty stellar. So I really like this one. And finally, I did read 2 graphic novels that were Trek. I read first this one, The Next Generation Forgiveness, written by David Brin. This was sent to me by one of my co-hosts for Book Trek, Brandy, over at the Book Collectic. She had acquired this, but she hates graphic novels for some irrational reason. I don't know why. But she said, hey, you want this? I'll send it to you. I said, yeah, definitely. I love graphic novels. And I think that the artwork in this is actually quite good. I like this a lot. Really cool concept they're dealing with. A lot of it has to do with transporters and the history of the creation of the transporter and the controversy that surrounded it. We're talking basically late 21st century, and people concerned that a transporter doesn't just, deliver a body from one place to another, but a soul is destroyed along the way. So there's religious, basically rejections to transporters, and that's introduced in this. And I thought that stuff was actually really fascinating. I did not like how they resolved it. I thought it was overly simplified and kind of dumb in certain ways. But leading up to that, I really liked it. So I really liked about 90% of this. It was the last 10% that I was like, ugh, kind of dropped the ball. But overall, I did like it. And finally, this is the last thing I read in June. Well, actually, Claudius technically was, but this is So Long a Sacrifice. So this is a Star Trek Deep Space Nine graphic novel written by Scott and David Tipton. I had read 2 other graphic novels that were Star Trek by them last year, and I liked both of them. And I also like this. So this is a murder mystery on Deep Space Nine. We have some people being, winding up dead in various ways. Sometimes explosions or poison or stabbings, I think was one of them. And Odo, the chief of security, is trying to figure it out because there's pressure from the Federation to find the murderer because he is murdering people of various races, and those home planets are getting angry. They send a Beta Z investigator to help Odo. And that character actually ends up being really interesting because this all takes place during the Dominion War when the Federation is fighting a very powerful empire from on the other side of the wormhole that is next to Deep Space Nine. And Betazoid, one of the planets, has been taken over by that Dominion and is occupied by the Dominion. So we have this Beta Z who shows up and he sees Odo. Odo's species is the controller, or the controllers of the Dominion. So he has some prejudice that he has to overcome, and all that stuff in the background I think is pretty good. All the war stuff, the misgivings, and the murder mystery itself is fine. You're not going to crack the case early on or anything like that. They don't give you enough information for that, but overall I thought it was pretty good. So a lot of this had to deal with war as it was going on now, and now that I think of it, also the trauma of war. We have connections to when the Cardassians occupied Bajor. That's the memories of that as well. So solid, nothing spectacular, but it was solid. So let me see if I can hold all these up in a way that, especially, I'm not going to destroy things. Quite a pile. But this is what I read in June of 2023. So we got some Star Trek graphic novels. We've got My Cousin Rachel, Tales of Valhalla, Phantom of the Opera, Claudius, The Vulcan Academy Murders, and The Tall Stranger. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.